I'd like to invite Professor Shilpa Das, the Vice Chair of IDSC, to give a brief note about the topic of the conference and allow us to begin with the evening's programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ritvik Bhattacharya. Good afternoon and warm greetings to all the distinguished dignitaries here today. Professor Jaswinder Singh, Principal, Shri Guru Tegh Bahadur Khalsa College, Professor Vibha Singh Ji, Principal, Kirorimal College, Professor Tom Shakespeare, the staff and students of both these colleges from Delhi University, the Center for Disability Research and Training at Kirorimal College, the paper presenters at the conference, registered delegates, our sign language interpreters, students and volunteers, colleagues and friends from the Indian Disability Studies Collective. A warm welcome to everybody to this IDSC International Conference 2021. We need to, at the start, take a little time to understand the conceptual definitions of the term resistance, that is the bedrock of this conference, and reflect upon it. Particularly pertinent to the conference are two ways of conceptualizing the term resistance. One, as actions that not only reject subordination, but do so by challenging the ideologies that support subordination. And two, as actions involving consciousness, collective action, and direct challenges to structures of power. So how may the individual and or the collective self be conserved against oppression? It can be conserved through a broad range of behaviors and actions, ranging from acting autonomously and with agency, questioning the status quo, covert acts of defiance to overt rebellion, so that social systems, processes, and values may be recast. While all these definitions of resistance are implicated in this conference, the primary understanding of the term as it emerges here is based on identity in general and the disabled identity in particular. So this week, we propose to understand the concept of resistance, disruption, and transgression in relation to disability. The questions then which come up immediately are, what happens when we discuss resistance with respect to this particular identity in particular? When and where do disabled people tender resistance? Is it in everyday situations or in more systemic contexts? For example, within families, at the employment site, or with respect to the education system. What compels them to resist? What are the many ways in which disabled people resist oppressive able-bodied norms, values, and discriminatory practices like the idea of a normal body? How do they re-encounter and resist stigma, hierarchy, hegemony, and social control? How do they issue a challenge to their personal realities, existing social structures, cultural labels and prescriptions and proscriptions that serve to demean and devalue them? What are these various levels, at a meso, micro, or macro level, at the level of the individual, institutions, or ideologies that disabled people tender resistance? Is there a way for us to categorize such resistance? What do we mean by passive or active resistance in the context of disability? And how might we move from narrower conceptions of resistance in everyday lives in the context of disability to more broadly based ones? What are these conceptions? How might the complexity of the phenomenon or action or opposition be captured? Can we have a more nuanced understanding of how hegemony and resistance operate in this context? The deliberations of the conference will surely lead us to alternative ways of responding to these or answers to these and other related emergent questions, with, of course, a focus on the complexities that the terms resistance, disruption, and transgression themselves present. The broad array of abstracts that we received in response to the call for proposals and the papers to be presented this week examine in diverse ways different socio-cultural entities and existences across a broad range of geographies and entangled with the needs of phenomenal resistance, disruption, and transgression. So resistance that is tendered to the establishment through the stigma of disability, to able-bodied hegemonies, as well as the manner and modes in which such resistance is offered is what we'll see. They appear to cover a broad range of expression and discursive strategies, from shunning this very tenderness that is hurtful to us, as one of our presenters states, to living life to the fullest, as another scholar articulates, to what a third presenter calls resisting ableism in the everyday, that which would give an understanding of less institutionalized but more pervasive forms and modes. Through these strategies, they consciously seek to question existing social structures, resist both the oppression and the restrictive social environment, as well as their attributed identities, and more importantly, to rethink disability identities. There's a sense of action or active behavior is an important element of resistance here. As Jean Baudrillard argues, that strategies of resistance always change to reflect strategies of control. And against a system that excludes or represses the individual, the natural demand is one of inclusion, to become a subject. In fact, the Slovenian philosopher Žižek proposes a radical act that jumps outside the coordinates of the dominant system, including any opposition tied to these coordinates. This act transcends resistance itself. We must note here at this point that the heterogeneity of standpoint experience is as important as the commonalities of collective confrontation in the resistance of disability as social oppression. Now, giving it primacy means that we foreground forms of subjectivity and embodiment with a subversive potential for resistance. That is how our positionality or positional perspective as disabled people can serve as a place from where values are interpreted and constructed. So, interrogating disability as a political position. Now, there is in this way a negotiation of the self in relation to disabled people's perception of our everyday existence, so as to construct and establish a socially coherent and unique disabled identity. Now, so let me quote Professor Meenakshi Thapan here, when she says that inextricable with embodiment in these constructions of identities is the element of resistance, not only in the way that they play out the struggles of our lives in the real world, but also in the way that they construct the tropes of our stories and wrest agency for ourselves the moment we spot the possibility of struggle and any consequent change. So this resistance to the dominant social order, she says, with its attendant stigmas, enables us to bring in a real degree of transformation and positive change in our lives, which in turn fuels us with an inner strength with both the material and subjective aspects of our embodiment. Needless to say, this self-concept is vested with a dignity that is our own. So the conference tracks are diverse, and we look forward to the papers presented in them, clarifying substantive issues that underlie these tracks, namely disability and existence, disability and assertion, disability and gender, disability and discourse, disability with respect to performance, narrativizing disability, writing disability and disabled writing, and literary narratives, disability and education. We shall also examine in another track how disabled people offer resistance to their stigmatized disabled identities by narrating life histories on disability. So let us all look forward to some engaging paper presentations, stimulating discussions, and critical deliberations over the course of the week that will advance our understanding of the dynamic and dialectical nature of resistance to, of, and by disability, and in doing so, broaden our understanding and knowledge of it. With that, I now invite Professor Nandini Ghosh to chair the next session that we have all been waiting for, Professor Tom Shakespeare's keynote address. Professor Nandini Ghosh is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. Her areas of interest are qualitative research methodology, sociology of gender, marginalization, and social exclusion and social movements. She has published a monograph titled Impaired Bodies, Gendered Lives, Everyday Realities of Disabled Women in 2016, edited a volume titled Interrogating Disability in India, Theory and Practice, published by Springer in 2016. She has also co-edited 2 books, Pratyaha Everyday Life Worlds, published by Primus in 2015, and Caste and Gender in Contemporary India, Power, Privilege and Politics in 2018. So over to you, Professor Ghosh, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shilpa, Professor Shilpa Das. It is my pleasure to invite Professor Tom Shakespeare to this second IDSC conference. Professor Tom Shakespeare is a leading disability scholar and activist from the United Kingdom, sociologist and bioethicist. He has taught in different universities across UK. He has also worked as a technical officer at the World Health Organization, Geneva. He has a lot of books to his name, primarily Sexual Politics of Disability, 1996, Disability Rights and Wrongs, 2006, and which was printed and published in 2014, Disability, the Basics. He has also co-authored and co-edited the World Report on Disability in 2011 and International Perspectives on Spinal Cord Injury 2014 during his tenure at the WHO. Tom has been a member of the Arts Council of England and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Tom's research on disabled people in UK and Africa have explored the areas of social and economic consequences of impairment and illness. And he teaches disability and development, including disability rights, sexual and reproductive health of disabled people, disability and mental health. He's also a regular contributor to BBC Radio and writes regularly for The Lancet. Welcome, Tom. It's a pleasure to have you here at the conference and to meet you again online though. I hand it over to you, Tom, now.
Thank you very much, Nandini, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. It was typical that just on the stroke of being introduced, the drilling started. So I'm hoping that you have good audio and we can have a good interaction. It's a great honor to be with you all, friends. I've spent many happy hours in India, most recently in Vellore, but I've also been to many cities like Delhi and Agra and Pune and Mumbai and so forth. And I look forward to the day when I can come back and we can safely discuss these ideas face to face. What I would like to do is to share my screen. Host disabled participant screen sharing. You're not allowing me to share my screen. I can just talk through if you'd want to, but it's up to you.
No, you can share. Ritvik, will you please enable the screen sharing?
So what I wanted to do while we're waiting for it to be enabled was to briefly tell you about, thank you very much, briefly tell you about my center. So I'm, as introduced, I am at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We're mainly public health, development studies and so forth. I am co-director of the Pender program, where we're really, it's very practical, it's very engaged work. So we have a project, PENDA program, funded by the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, which is about interventions to improve the lives of disabled people. Succeed program is basically CBR in 4 African countries. We're going to do some work with young people funded by MasterCard. And we also have the Disability Evidence Portal, which is disabilityevidence.org. And what we're trying to do there is to meet the evidence gap. There's a huge evidence gap, as you know, in terms of people with disabilities' lives in Asia, in Africa, in South America, and what works to make them better. So this portal is all about that. So this is a conference about agency and resistance. And I wanted to highlight that, you know, certainly in British disability studies, we have a conflict between the traditional medical model, the idea that we can't do things because our bodies or minds don't let us, and the social model, the fact that we can't do things because of social barriers, prejudice, ableism, or whatever you'd like to call it. I'm just going to get a little bit closer to my microphone, so I hope that you can hear me and the drilling doesn't disturb you. I apologize. But the problem with both these models is, where does agency and resistance grow? Because in both models, they're about people being disabled. And many of our ways of thinking about disability are about ableism or compulsory able-bodiedness or whatever else it is. Where does agency and resistance go? So today I think that disability comprises a range of intrinsic factors and a range of extrinsic factors. And I know that many of you are doing literary studies or cultural studies. You're interested in cultural meanings and representations. Others are doing psychology. You're interested in motivation or identity or self-belief, or you might be interested in social psychology, the roles and expectations that society puts on disabled people. I think it's, from a materialist position, it's worth looking at things like buildings, accessibility, transport, all those barriers. Somebody should be putting that thing on mute, because it's not me. I think that we should also take into account the type and severity of impairment. Because, for example, I have a spinal cord injury, which is a consequence on my achondroplasia. It's very low. If it was higher, it'd be much more difficult. It's a fact of life. So if you're completely blind, as opposed to you have some sight, that's a difference too. So that this also informs. So we have intrinsic and extrinsic factors. And it's really the interaction between the two of them is my understanding of what disability means to individuals. So what I've put here, I'm not going to read them all out, but when you look at the articles about disability in Africa, they're mainly negative. They're about, I'm going to read out a few of the words that I've put on this screen. Severely marginalized, underprivileged, poorest, exclusion, poverty, lots of problem words. And I am going to say to you that I think the consequence of all of these, and it doesn't matter whether they're from a medical model or a social model, is to suggest that Africans with disabilities cannot exhibit resistance and agency. Yet, at the same time, those of us who work in Africa work with really strong activists who and advocates who are very proud, who are very positive, who get on with their life. So how can we make this square this circle, if you like? And here, I think it's, and it may also be relevant, very relevant for poor places in India as well. We have colonial legacies. We have, the Raj in India, or we have the Portuguese or the French or the British in Africa. So that obviously influences deep cultural beliefs about disability and incapacity. And that's the case in Africa, and I think in Asia. Poverty. We know from empirical research that disabled people live in poorer households, and that this can be a sort of multi-dimensional poverty. It's not just about the money they receive, it's about the assets they have, about the quality of life they have. We know there's a lack of access to rehabilitation, to wheelchairs. My dear friend Chapel Kasnavis, who used to be head of Mobility India, has told me that he thinks that less than 15%, 15% of people in the world have the mobility and assisted devices they need. We know about travel and transport barriers. We know about, for example, in school, the class sizes, lack of classroom support, teacher attitudes. So there's a whole lot of negativity. What the project I did was called Levers of Success. I wanted to understand how people resisted, how people in Africa were able to get on with their lives. And I wanted to do this a bit like Professor Nandini with qualitative research. I wanted to gather the stories. So I went out, and this paper is based on my work in Zambia, Uganda, and Kenya. And I interviewed disabled people, and on the slide I've put out the people that I work with. They were mainly recruited through organizations, people with disabilities, non-governmental organizations like Learning Cheshire. We wanted a range of impairments. So they're mainly physical and sensory impairments. They're not mental health or intellectual disabilities. And we got about 40 people from Uganda, 33 people from Kenya, 40 people from Zambia, who self-identified as successful disabled people. So I've just put up a picture of me and some researchers, and we went off in a minibus or a car, and we interviewed people. So how do we analyze it? Very, very briefly, it was framework analysis using Excel, which I think is a very good methodology. The themes, obviously, it was inductive. The themes emerged in the transcripts, initially just descriptive and then increasingly analytical. And we charted. We had charts for, obviously, Uganda, Kenya, and also Zambia. And each chart had a horizontal line in the typical framework analysis way. We had a participant, and then we divided up their experiences, and we had different pages. So we had a page for their I don't know, employment experiences. We had a page for their aids and adaptations. And that way we were able to go with the eye or the screen reader, look down a column and compare people's experiences. So very briefly again, we had a few people who were deaf or had hearing loss, 2 in Kenya, 5 in Uganda, 9 in Zambia. Some people had sight loss or blindness, 4 in Kenya, 9 in Uganda, 7 in Zambia. Some people who are albino, which is a big problem in East Africa, 2 in Kenya, Uganda, and Zambia, so that's a total of 6. We had some people with restricted growth, like Nandini and myself, 3 in Uganda, 2 in Zambia. We had about 10 polio survivors from each place, and then we had another 10 or 12 mobility impairment, and a few missing or not otherwise specified. So what did they do? They worked for a DPO, they're a teacher, they work for an NGO, they work for a bank, they're a junior civil servant, they're a middle rank civil servant, they're a very senior civil servant, they were a lawyer, they worked in the brewery, they're a photographer, bus inspector, politician, consultant, electronic repair, telephone operator, rice trader, craft workshop, farmer, fruit farmer, pig farmer, bee farmer, fish farmer, chicken farmer, peanut butter producer, tailor, cobbler, garment industry, embroiderer, knitter, owns a shop, does projects, owns motorcycles and rents them out, or a counsellor. So that's all of the people on the slide. There really were a lot of stuff, and it is normal stuff. And of course, some of these are rural, some of these are urban, and you can see that the farming people are more likely to be rural. But these were successful people. And other markers of success, they said to me things like, I was the only member of my family to complete the school. They said, I am the one of all of my siblings who are looking after my elderly parents because I'm more successful than my brothers and sisters. I'm paying for the school fees of my brothers and sisters. I have a partner. I have children. So in Kenya, 23 out of 33 were married or in long-term relationships, 54 children. In Uganda, 22 out of 40 were married or in long-term relationships, 84 had children. So, just some examples, they were getting on with life. This is a slide about family reaction, because I want to say that many of these children who were born with disabilities face negative attitudes. The elder brother who does not accept or respect me, the mother who refuses to give the child up when others advise to leave him in the forest to die. Another where the father walks out, feels that schooling is a waste of time. Another where the grandmother encourages the family to leave the child to die. Another with the birth mother who walks out because she can't attend to his needs. another where the mother-in-law were very, the mother, the sister, and the mother-in-law were all very negative about this person who had disability. So I know this happens in India also, but in Africa, there's a lot of negativity when there is either the birth of a disabled child or a child becomes blind, deaf, or paralyzed, as sometimes happens with disease and accident. So there's a lot of negativity. And this is based on a feeling that disabled people can't do anything, that they're rubbish, that they are going to be a failure and they're going to be a cost to the family. I've put this before. I've put a slide here, and this is for Nandini to smile at. This is a picture from the little people of Uganda. It's a really nice slide of people with achondroplasia, children, and who are the most beautiful children in the world. I just wanted to show that there is DPO, NGO development in these countries. So let's just think about schooling. Now, our narrative is that disabled people are out of school in Africa. And it's true that 10 folk in Kenya, 4 in Uganda, and 7 in Zambia didn't complete their schooling, their basic schooling. But a number did, 2 in Uganda, Kenya, Uganda, 3 in Uganda, 8 in Zambia, got their highest level of schooling was secondary. Now, 8 people in each country, their highest level of schooling was diploma. And these were usually teachers, because the diploma is in teaching, but there could be in a few other sort of practical things. A lot of people were graduates. So 4 each in Kenya and Zambia. But a staggering 15 of my respondents in Uganda were graduates. And that's because Uganda sponsors the education of disabled students at university. So they have government money. And of course, the fees are the main obstacle. So suddenly 15, that's nearly half my respondents in Uganda. And in fact, 8 of them were postgraduate trained compared to about 5 each in Kenya and Zambia. And of course, I don't have data for everybody. But it shows that people do achieve, they persevere. I remember talking to a young man from, well, 30, 40-year-old from Zambia. And he had polio and he used sticks. And he said, I was the only member of my family to finish school. And I said, it must have been very difficult for you to go to school with using sticks and inaccessibility. And he said, yeah, it took me 3 hours morning and evening to go to school. 3 hours, my friends. That is really a tremendous achievement. In the whole of his schooling, he had to walk, walk, walk. So against the obstacles, against the barriers, some thrown by their impairment, some by the school. I'm going to tell you that in a minute. So barriers in education, I'm going to tell you that. So bullying. So the other pupils used to take away the walking stick to test how he would walk without them. Well, if you're mobility impaired, you won't walk, you'll fall over. They laughed. Teachers and students mocking the person with restricted growth, mocking, ostracized, problems in toilets, problems in queues, problems for other people, neglect the deaf person who dropped out of school. But yet the barriers, they resisted. Like I said, I'm the only member of my family to finish school. Somebody else said, it's like every time I reach a certain stage, I realize I can still do something else. And this is called adversity inoculation. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So there were loads of barriers of bullying and teasing and bad treatment. Now, what did they become? What jobs did they go on to do? Well, they were educated people. They were successful people. They were self-selected to be successful because I wanted to find the success stories. And so about 4 to 6 of them in each country worked for the civil service. A number of them were teachers, particularly in Zambia, because that's where I found, that's how I recruited. I just got teachers. Some worked for an NGO or a DPO, particularly in Uganda. There's a very strong disabled people's movement in Uganda. Disabled representation is written into the constitution of Uganda at every level, from village, district, and up to parliament. There are places for disabled people. So of course they have a lot of potential. Some were working in business, 1 in Kenya, 5 in Uganda, 3 in Zambia. Some were self-employed, about half a dozen people were retail, trades, cobbler, seamstress, and so forth. Sorry, no, those are the traders, I beg your pardon, about half a dozen. Some were craft, sewer and cobbler. 5 in Kenya, 2 in Uganda, and 6 in Zambia. A number were farming, 3, 2, 3, they were farmers. And of course, I don't have everybody, and some people were students. So, but basically they were employed, they were doing good jobs, they were successful, they were resisting, they showed agency, really interesting. So they faced a lot of discrimination, poor treatment, and that's why, for example, in Uganda, a lot worked in disabled people's organizations. Might be easier to get ahead. A lot were self-employed, not because they chose it, because they faced barriers in the mainstream labor market. So what could they do? You know, they could farm, they could learn a craft. So this gentleman was a tailor, and then he learned photography. Another couldn't get the job that she sought in a DPO, so they opened a shop. And they really tried really hard in their work not to ask for help, to be independent. So this basic idea that people will, you know, this is agency, this is resistance, this is doing your best. So I think there's a lot of it out there. This is me with a gentleman in Zambia, and he had osteomyelitis and was crippled in his leg, and he was a street tailor. So this is a picture of me in his shop, and you can see outside, yeah, it's just an ordinary shop down an alley. And as a researcher, I was paralyzed at this stage. I thought, how on earth am I going to get down there? And I got down there because the driver of our vehicle took one arm, and my co-researcher Joseph took my other arm, and they kind of frog marched me down the alley. I didn't even have my wheelchair, and so then with my sticks, I got into this little shack basically. And the first thing he said is, "Why have you come to interview me? Why are you, professor from England, interested in me?" And I'm interested in this gentleman because he is married, he has 3 children, he earns a living. And how does he do that? And I said that, how do you survive? And he said, the grace of God. Now, in Britain and Europe, I can assure you, nobody ever credits God with their success. But in Zambia and many African countries, it is God that gives people the sense that they are important, that they are worthwhile, and that they will be okay. In this gentleman's case, it was also his sister who gave him a sewing machine, and his brother-in-law who gave him lessons, paid for the lessons to use the sewing machine. And between them, they helped him make a living for himself. He also was useful because he was getting about with a stick. And somebody saw him, and they ran up and they said, "Here, have this walking stick. You need a proper walking stick." So these things, which came from benefactors, really made a difference to him. They enabled him to be a productive person. And while I was there in his shack, people came in, "Can you alter this? Can you change that? Will you do this by tomorrow?" And that's his work. And he works for everybody else, and he earns a good living. So barriers in business, you know about this, like microfinance, will you pay us back? Like, but despite these barriers, many barriers, people said things like, if I start pitying myself, I will fail. Nobody cares about me and nobody's willing to help me. So I have to cope with whatever comes ahead of me. So great sense of determination. Another person with spinal cord injury, "I want to show my fellow PWDs that we can make it. And when I fully recover, I have a vision that I want to create job opportunities for others." So a real sense of purpose, these are people that are not going to be defeated, either by impairment or by disabling barriers. And why did they have success? Well, they said a lot of things: the support of my family, hard work, self-determination, perseverance, self-belief, hard work, determination, being focused, independent-minded, a refusal to accept charity, confidence, charisma, resilience, hard work and prayer, and as I've said before, the grace of God. So, mostly these are individual or divine explanations for success, yeah? There's a few that talk about support of family, but mostly it's me, and in a way, if you went out in the streets of Delhi or Calcutta or wherever you are and found somebody successful and said, "How are you successful, sir?" He would say, "Because of my hard work, I got where I am today." That's what all successful people say. So it's not that surprising. But it is interesting that they see it as a individual resilience, resistance. And they do face many, many barriers. So here's a quotation from a gentleman from Zambia. This is the one with a spinal cord injury, not involved with a disability DPO, did his education from a hospital, runs a grocery shop, employs people, and now he's looking to try and start a relationship. He's good at the deal. I mean, he might be in a wheelchair, but he is really, working. So I'm sure that by now he hopefully has found somebody to marry. And this woman from Kenya is very interesting. So she had, I think, thalidomide. She's from a middle class background. She was born in a hospital. Very few Africans are born in a hospital. And because she was born in a hospital, despite the fact of having sort of phocomelia, malformed arms, limbs, she wasn't killed at birth. If he'd been a poor person in a country, rural setting, somebody with her disability would probably not have survived. The neighbors believed that she was an evil spirit. So her father was able to pay the fees in a boarding school, and she had a classroom assistant to do things for her, but she faced a lot of bullying. And that bullying made her determined. Her intelligence, her class, and her resistance made her determined. So this is what she said: look at yourself as a person, not a disabled person. Look at yourself and say, this is my life, see what I can make of it. And here, sorry, I've flipped ahead. Here, this is what she did. She got a master's overseas. She said, you can do what you can, at least, to change the mind of those negative and attitudes. And there are also positive ones, positive people who come to embrace you. So she faced a lot of discrimination. She was very clever. She used people skills. She said she defied people to look at her impairment and said, I will survive. She didn't have a husband or a boyfriend, so she hadn't succeeded in that area. But economically, she'd really succeeded. And it was very interesting because I said to her, well, she's at the end of her career. She said, I'm going to retire. I bought a piece of land and I'm going to retire there and build a house, and that's where I'm going to live. And I said, is that in your village where you come from? And she said, oh, no. So it's a big distance from my family. And I thought, oh, that's very strange. Why would you do that? And then I realized that her family had probably been pestering her for money and for support all her adult life. And she didn't want to retire and have them try and move in and take over. She wanted her independence. Great woman. So this is just a picture. It's not of anybody. This is a picture from Tanzania, my friend Faustina, and they're training disabled people to use wheelchairs, and they're forming a very strong disabled people's organization. So I just want to talk, if I may, if I have time, about the psychology of resilience. And this is very relevant for agency. And if you look at the psychological literature, actually, human beings have the capacity for resilience and resistance in the face of trauma. And this really important psychologist called Deborah Marston, and I'm going to read her quotation. Resilience does not come from rare and special qualities, but from the everyday magic. That's the phrase she uses. Everyday magic of ordinary normative human resources in the minds, brains, bodies of children, in their families, relationships, in their communities. So basically, all human beings have this capacity. Obviously, our positioning, our gender, our class, influence what we can do with it. But we all have this capacity. And there's this phrase that I mentioned before called adversity inoculation. And what that is that for your sense of self, for your sense of personhood, it's very, very useful to have small obstacles which you can overcome. And you overcome one obstacle, and then you think, all right, I'll try the next one. You overcome that, and you feel stronger. And then you know, the constant adversity. Now it has to be a small obstacle. It can't be if it's a very big obstacle, there's no way you can overcome it. You fail, and you feel really bad about yourself. But if it's a small obstacle which you overcome, then you steadily, bit by bit, feel better about yourself. And I can tell you this work. This is, you know this in your life, but it worked for me. For example, I went to my first country, Zambia in Africa, and I thought, oh yeah, I'll try that one. And you know what? I gathered the data. I felt really good. I had a really good collaborator, got some great interviews. I thought, okay, I've done it. And then my colleagues in the network said, no, you've got to go to Uganda and Kenya. I thought, oh, yeah, scary, not sure I can do this. But I had successfully done Zambia, so I went to Uganda. in Kenya, and that was very successful. And then I was like, I am the researcher, I can do Africa. And so when somebody said, right, next, Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone is one of the poorest countries in the world, it's had civil war, it's had Ebola, it's really hard work to live in. And I thought, well, I've done those other 3 countries, I'll do this one too. And I went, and great people, I showed you on the slide, and they really helped me. And you know, the fact that they didn't so much work in Sierra Leone is not because it's a bad place, it's a great place. So this steady adversity, and disability gives you that adversity. There is no, we have plenty of adversity, but if we can overcome it in small steps, we will feel £1 million. And that's the reason that a lot of disabled people are really strong, because we've had to face down this problem. And also, I have to say, the ones who tend to succeed have emotional intelligence, probably have intellectual intelligence too. They can make the most of their situation. Tell you very briefly, this deaf woman I spoke to, I think in Kenya, and we communicated in the sign language. And I said, that must have been very difficult. You know, she came from a very poor family. They didn't even own land. They were like peasants, sharecroppers on other people's land. And her father was told, you know, abandon this child. Don't spend education on this girl who's deaf. Forget it. She's never going to amount to anything. And yet the school fees were paid. And she was in a big class. In African schools, there's maybe 80 children in a class. No sign language interpreter. So what did she do? Well, she sat not hearing anything through the class. Then she found the cleverest person in the class, and she copied their notes. And if they didn't understand them, she copied somebody else's notes. And by this, she gained the content, working of every lesson, and learnt it. And in African schooling, a lot of it is about rote learning. And if you can learn it off by heart, you're going to pass the exam. And she did. She learned it off by heart. She passed the exam. She got O levels. She got A levels. Then she went to train as a teacher. She got into primary teaching. And then she thought, oh, I'm not a such for this. I'm going to get a degree in education. And that's where she got sign language. And then she got a master's in curriculum design. And she's now a deaf woman, a teacher who is learning about and studying curriculum development for deaf children so they can have access to the curriculum. I mean, she's done brilliantly. She's a successful professional person, and yet they came from a very poor background. Now that was intelligence. Some children would just have sat there, not learnt anything, gone home, not got anywhere. But she was really intelligent, so it really makes a difference. And also she could persuade people to show her notes. That's really impressive. She's obviously a really good kid. So I want to say, disabled people adapt. Disabled people also adapt. And if you look at that wonderful paper by Gary Albrecht and Patrick Delija, now 20 years old, the quality of life of many, not all, many disabled people is the same as everybody else, sometimes better. I think non-disabled people mistakenly think disabled people have a low quality of life. And this quote from Ron Amundsen, my friend at Hawaii, and it's about hedonic adaptation, a great paper if you have time to read it. And I've got all the references at the end of this PowerPoint. Hedonic adaptation that produces real changes in quality of life, not false consciousness. So it's not just that these disabled people think that they're okay, but they're really not. It's that they are okay. They have adapted. They have got on. They've shown what you're talking about this conference, resistance and agency. So I think it's a really, really good example. And you will find this. You've got this in India. So I think finding the qualitative research is really important, doing that research. How do they survive? Very briefly, family support. I've told you about how terrible families could be. They could also be really good. My parents love me and they show me the others that I'm a child to them just like the others. I cannot begin to think of how my life would have been without family support. This gentleman from Uganda, he had brothers, they used to carry him 5 kilometers to school, then between each class and then to the toilet. And this gentleman in Zambia who's blind, and his mother said to him, you of all my children must finish school, because she knows that the blind kid is not going to survive unless he's able to use his or her intelligence. And this gentleman became the headmaster of a school for the blind. So, and then there are external supports. And now, not all of my respondents are rich or middle class. That lady with Folklamilia was, but mostly weren't. But they had family support. And I think education, education, education. So in many cases, donors paid the school fees. Maybe an American lady, a German wife of a Ugandan doctor, a British teacher, a Dutch NGO, a wealthy neighbor. But time and time again, they said they were very poor, but somebody else paid their school fees. And many were sponsored at university, either by the government or by the Catholic Church or by Compassion International or by Abilis, which is Finnish, or by a charitable trust or even a disabled people's organization. That enabled them to get university schooling. I told you how they were given assistive devices, the wheelchair, the crutches and so forth. They were given help in getting a job. They might be given loans for their farming. So you can see that this, yes, they all said, my drive, that got there. And it's true, without that, they probably wouldn't get there, but they also had lots and lots of external support. Think back to my little grid, yeah? So it's partly about internal, whatever it was called, ordinary magic, but it's partly about being in an environment which recognizes you and supports you. And of course, because they were bright kids and because they worked hard, they were going to get those donors. If they'd been lazy or if they'd been stupid, I'm afraid to say they wouldn't. But the clever kids will get more. To those that have, more will be given. And so we need to try and spread the love, really. So I've told you about the impairment, the internal resources. These are very positive people, a high IQ probably. They are disabled, but that's only one part of their identity. Adrian Ash says, look, don't take a part for the whole. They're men, they're women, they're poor, they're wealthy, they're rural, they're urban, they're disabled. All of these things interact. So let me conclude. I want in the study to challenge the negative assumption that implied disabled people can never do well. I want to say it makes sense if you're doing development to invest in disabled people and barrier removal, because it will repay. These people are wealthier, well, they're not wealthy, but they're living for themselves on an equal basis with others. They're helping other people in their family. They're promoting education. This is good for development of the nation. Now, some people who are very bright, very motivated, very resilient, do achieve success, absolutely the same as other non-disabled people. But I think that, I went out and looked for these people and I found them. They're not Olympic prize winners, they're just ordinary people, but they're successful. And I found them without difficulty. I could have made it a much bigger study. But what we need to, they're going to be okay, but the next lot of disabled people down are not going to be okay. So we need to remove the barriers so that other disabled people can have this level of success. Education being one of them. But also, what about people with a learning disability, with intellectual disability? What about autistic people? What about people with psychosis or other conditions? How can we make sure that they also flourish? Because what I want to say is that disabled people can flourish. We can have good lives. I want just briefly to acknowledge the government, the Economic Social Research Council, and the agency Leonard Cheshire Disability, who helped me in the research, and a lot of people. So thank you. I published one paper in African Journal of Disability, which you can read, and I need to publish others. Well, there's a couple of others out there. But I think that if we go out and do quality research, we're going to find a lot more of these stories. And I know that you are also interested in this, so I hope you can gather them in India and gather more of them in India, because that changes minds, changes government, changes NGOs, changes our perception of what disability is. We need to break the link between disability and incapacity. We need to be able to say we are disabled, strong, we're doing good, and we will do more good. So thank you very much for your time and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tom, Professor Shakespeare. It was really, really heartening to hear some of the things that we are talking here in terms of disability activism also, that disability is not incapacity and disabled people also can flourish. So thank you so much for coming here and speaking to us.